So what I'm going to start with is just telling you a little bit about a research project I was involved in, which I think has some interesting messages for us to be thinking about in the light of the discussions that have happened already today. So just tell you a little bit about the study. So this was student teachers. I won't call them trainees, as we're forced to call them in England. I'll call them student teachers, people who are preparing to be teachers in their initial teacher education. And the methodology was I would sit in a lesson, I would observe absolutely everything they said, absolutely everything they did, make lots and lots and lots of notes on it. And then as soon as possible, straight after the lesson, we'd sit down and we'd go through the notes and we'd have probably more than an hour's discussion, really trying to unpick together what it was that they were trying to do every moment in that lesson, what it was that they were really trying to achieve. And from that, collected lots of data from the observations, from the interviews, and started to come up with some interesting patterns and themes, which is mainly what I'm going to be talking to you about today. But I'll just start with some of the data itself, some of the things that these students were saying. These were the students who were talking about that lesson that we just looked at together, purely in terms of getting through tasks, getting things done, staying in control, looking like a teacher. They weren't talking about learning. This is really typical. If you remember your own student-teacher education, when you first start on a placement, you know, those early days, you're just trying to get through the lesson and survive intact. And that's absolutely what you expect from students at a particular stage. So the identity for this category was really just about getting in control, getting things done, getting through to the end of the lesson intact, surviving. So quite different from task managers, you know, really good thing, they're talking about learning. The thing that stopped them from sliding to the next category, though, is when you started to talk to them about why those learning outcomes were important, what the value was for those pupils in that context, that's when they began to struggle. So they could see that the learning was important because somebody had told them this is what this lesson needs to cover. So it's in the scheme, it's in the national curriculum. Increasingly my data, because it was during a period when the national strategies were being introduced in England, it's because it's in the national strategies. If I probed further and said, so why did that particular learning outcome really matter? How would it apply beyond this lesson? Why did it matter for this child that they understood it in this way? They really were quite surprised at being asked that question and struggled to come up with an answer. And again, you can see that this could well be a developmental thing. I think you go through a period initially where you have to just get on top of behaviour and know that you've got the routines and all of that kind of worked out. Then you start to think about learning, but then you're really just trying to cover what somebody else has maybe given to you. So very often these would be students sort of middle way through a placement where they're starting to take on some lessons that maybe somebody else has been involved in planning, and they're just sort of delivering them. So that's why it's a curriculum deliverer kind of mode. So there is a sort of an aspect of maybe you have to go through this before you can come out the other side and become a concept skill builder, which I'll explain in a minute. But their teacher identity, what was coming through the data in terms of what they thought they needed to be successful, it was all about covering this curriculum, complying to these rules, conforming to this scheme. And that for them was as far as they could get in their thinking really. That was quite enough for them to have to just make sure they were doing that. And really they had no time to really think beyond that, and really struggled with the questions where I was trying to ask them about it. Very much focused on whatever the subject of that lesson was. For me, these were all English lessons. Why it mattered. Now, quite often they were incredibly self-critical. So it wasn't that they were claiming that their practice was perfect in any way, but they were talking about what they were trying to do, even though often they were telling me that they hadn't succeeded, in these terms. Why this particular concept, this particular piece of learning, this particular skill that was being applied, why it mattered, why it had value. And the really good ones were able to talk about how it could link to other lessons within that subject or other subjects, or even beyond sort of school learning altogether, and why this is knowledge, this is understanding that is really helpful for pupils in their development. It's not so much about knowing loads and loads and loads and loads of things. So if you're trying to do a really good geography lesson, it's not you need to know everything there is about geography. It's much more that you know the underlying principles, the core concepts of that subject, and you know how to make it relevant to the stage of development the pupils are at. So what would be called pedagogical content knowledge, how you make that learning accessible. What Bruner would describe as, you know, that spiral curriculum. You can teach anything to any child as long as you have the core knowledge of the essence of that subject. You know how, using your pedagogical knowledge, you can make it relevant to a 5-year-old, to a 10-year-old, to a 15-year-old, and so on. So it's about understanding the meaningful patterns and how you can make it relevant to the understanding and the stage of development of the pupils that you're with. So then insight is simply applying that knowledge. It's knowing how in this incredibly complicated classroom environment you can select from all the sources of data and all sources of information that are available to you what knowledge is going to be most relevant, most useful to make this learning opportunity be as impactful as it possibly can do. So expert teachers develop this efficiency that means that they're doing lots and lots of these things without even being aware of it. And that actually is an issue for initial teacher education, but potentially for ongoing teacher development as well. There can be an assumption that all you need to do is talk to an expert and you'll be able to learn what it is that makes them an expert. And quite often, it's not that easy for them to explain because it has become so automatic that actually they're not even aware of it. And one of the things that the study showed was you need to develop this meta-awareness to be able to talk about it, to be able to critique it, to be able to compare it to other people's in order to keep developing. So the necessary contextual conditions we found, leadership is absolutely crucial. You know, across these 66 teaching school alliances, where the leadership weren't really bought into it, where they were just doing it because they thought they had to, it was much more likely to fail for the rest of the school. So that then translates into the cultures, the policies, the infrastructures within the school that will allow it to thrive. So where it thrived is where it was built into the staff meeting plan, the school development plan. Time was given. You know, it wasn't expected that people were just going to do it in their spare time. Where it failed was when not enough thought had gone into that. Now, obviously, I'm going to say this, but this was a finding, that you're much more likely to keep going with it and for it to be successful if you've got some kind of external support, often in this case from universities, but it doesn't have to be, but some kind of external expert other who could just help to give a bit more kind of freshness of thinking into what was going on in the school. So to conclude then, from me, good teacher development looks like these things. It has to be designed to be purposeful, developmental and relevant. So you have to feel like it's having that immediate impact on your practice and it's taking you on a journey of development and it's giving that meta understanding of where you are on that journey. Really, really crucial is you to really thrive at it, you've got to be in a context that's going to support it. It's much harder. You can be a really committed teacher who really wants to develop themselves, or really wants to develop collaborative action research. If you're not surrounded by colleagues who feel the same way, it's really hard to do. So the learning culture of an institution is really important. This is why I asked a question this morning about entitlement. I see NQTs and RQTs who desperately want to carry on their learning, but they just haven't got the kind of supportive conditions around them to do it. So what I would really like to see is this idea of a teacher journey which starts with the student-teacher development I've been mainly talking about, but then carries on through this kind of seamless progression where it's absolutely built in to what's expected if you join this profession, that you are going to be inquiring into your practice in this supported way that I've been describing throughout your career, because you know, you're never going to stop needing to have this meta-awareness of the impact that you're having in what you're trying to do. I think in England we're a long way off that, although you do see examples of it in some multi-academy trusts and some teaching school alliances who have managed to get their act together and create this seamless pathway where they're training the teachers initially and then they're taken through onto this journey. So my conclusion then is, I think in England there are some really good things happening in terms of school-led and schools being put in the driving seat. And the examples I've been drawing on in terms of good professional development and collaborative action research. The schools were driving what they wanted from that. They were determining the focus, they were deciding what kind of expertise they needed to add in, they were using expertise across their groups of schools. Them being in the driving seat was making it more powerful than if they weren't. You've got that practitioner expertise that only people who are doing the job day in can have, and that is being put right at the centre. But you can have, I think, a lot of additionality added by bringing in a university or another sort of expert organisation just to help you stand back, see the bigger picture, just to help you compare, contrast, critique, etc., just to help you situate what you're doing in the findings of other people's work as well as your own.